Hello, and welcome to Poetry at the Dalí with Helen Pruitt Wallace. I'm Hank Hine, the museum director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and to thank our sponsors, the City of St. Petersburg and the State of Florida Division of Arts and Culture. And as you know, Florida is the Freedom State. Our governor has attested to that. Helen Pruitt Wallace, Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg, traditionally reads a poem before this program begins. I will ask Helen to do so again today, and she will welcome our distinguished poets, Natasha Rao and Becca Mara McKay. Welcome to Poetry at the Dalí.
Thank you so much, Hank. It's a pleasure to be back with everybody for the Dalí Poetry Series. Thanks to all of you for tuning in, and thanks especially to our wonderful poets, Natasha Rao and Becca McKay, for joining us for this program. I do also want to thank the City of St. Petersburg for hosting our program, to all the wonderful Dalí staff who help with this program, and of course to Dr. Hine. So I will read one relatively new poem per Dr. Hine's request. So this is called 3 Black Socks. 3 black socks, and so the day has started. Around me, piles of laundry, my shoes somehow smirking. I sent you a prayer today. I don't know if you got it or if it's there on your windowsill, the one where your cup of tea grew cold, your black dog sleeping at your feet. Shape shifter you, how lovingly you gave yourselves away, those portals and you I never knew quite how to enter. You of the handstands, downward dog, daily shots of vinegar and honey you claimed cured everything it didn't prevent. In the end, so much it didn't prevent. I can't dig deep enough to reach the wells of you, trace your communion of saints, swing low, sweet chariot. But yes, I'd carry you home if only I could place it. The world looks different in your absence. Ghost apples glinting from boughs in freezing rain, empty globes encrusted in ice. I'm looking for beauty in your passing, to tap some part of me I lost with you and feel it, like I felt my small fist unfurl in the hollow of your palm. I'm going to first introduce Natasha Rao. Natasha Rao is the author of Latitude, which was selected by Ada Limón as the winner of the 2021 APR Honickman First Book Prize. She's also a recipient of a 2021 Ruth, Lilly, and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Fellowship from the Poetry Foundation. And she's also received fellowships from Bread Loaf, the Vermont Studio Center, and the Community of Writers. Her work appears in The Nation, American Poetry Review, the New York Times Magazine, Yale Review, and elsewhere. She holds a BA from Brown University and an MFA from NYU, where she was a Goldwater Fellow. She is currently an editor of American Chordata and lives in Brooklyn. Thank you so much, Natasha, for being with us, and congratulations on your award and your beautiful book.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Dr. Hine and Joy and Becca for reading with me. This is really, really lovely. So I am just going to jump right in and read some poems from the book. Oh, okay, thought it froze. We're all good. Okay, so I'm just going to jump in and read some poems. The book is called Latitude. And okay, here we go. What it was like. We had sushi that was so fresh, we blushed. Every 17 years, the cicadas rasped a kind of warning, showed us with increasing urgency the need to leave our old bodies behind. I thought I could make some kind of difference. I thought I could memorize enough facts to stay composed in debates and not cry after one glass of wine when my brother says we can all just go to Mars. I thought what I did was forgivable in the grand scheme of things, that your love was an inexhaustible resource. Terrible people made terrible decisions. Good people made terrible decisions. Which was I? It depended on the color of light in the bathroom, the angle at which I held my face to the mirror. I lived in a city at sea level level-headed now, the frailty underfoot. We pretended not to notice. We loved receiving shipments to our home, ceremoniously slashing packages with scissors, cleaving, leaving nothing but confetti. It was like sitting across from you at dinner and wondering when to tell you, knowing the worst is coming and simply ordering another drink. Meanwhile, the bubbles in the glass keep rising. It was luxurious. It was inevitable. It was a thick piece of fatty tuna, brimming with mercury, somehow effortless to swallow. The next poem I'll read is called Divine Transformation. Watching Jane nuns sweep peacock feathers across the earth, I wanted to become one of them. I was pupil, shifting in the uniform of my larval skin. The nuns practice ultimate nonviolence, brushing the floor with fallen feathers, cotton broom, unbleached wool, to avoid bruising any insect. It was, to me, an obvious way to live, before I saw myself as small, inelastic. I was large with guilt. Why girl? Why not mouse, moth? My mother asked, where do you see yourself in 10 years? And I said, barefoot, forest floor, fostering compassion, wearing a muslin cloth over my mouth to avoid swallowing some winged thing. I didn't auspicate the apartment in Brooklyn, sponging blood from mosquitoes off my wall. Could not imagine I would cultivate a new cruelty, not just obvious roach spray and rat trap, but killing the unobjectionable, gnats and fruit flies who inhabit this arbitrary world for just a breath. Last week, I ate exclusively the unborn, salmon roe and quail egg in one luscious bite. The distance between what I thought I was and what I am grows. I could have been a kind of fly. I could have been kind. Let's see. And then the next one I'll do is just on the next page. This one is called Fullness and Hunger. My father orders the crab croquet, and I am quick to correct croquette for the white waiter pouring water coquettishly. Last summer in England, I watched my brother grip a mallet on the manicured lawn of his new life, while my parents learned the rules to this ballet, beaming, and I sipped gin. My father's face when he hit the ball through the wicket. My father's face now, the slipped grin. My father's face in my face. I can be wicked, I begin to say, but it sounds like crickets. It sounds like nothing at all, though both our mouths are moving. Okay, now I will jump a little. The next poem I will read is called Or, and I wrote it after reading Nicole Seeley's poem called And, in which all of the words in the poem have the word and somewhere inside of them. So I thought that was really brilliant, and I love that poem. So I tried to do it with the word or. Or. Forgive earthworms for contorting. Prioritize forests before work or glory. Worship dormice. Forsake ordinariness. Forget conformity. Gorge words euphorically. Stories immortalize orgasm, horseflies, floral histories. Workshop emperors or gladiators rigorously. Explore discomfort, remorseless scorpions or forbidden seafloors. Reforest, dechlorinate, evaporate fluorescence. Memorize aphorisms before performing thunderstorms unforgettably. endeavor for gorgeous, borderless worlds, multicolored, unanchored orchestras, orbit memorably. Okay, let's see how we're doing on time. Okay, read a few more. This next one is called Another Spring. Another failed chance to vault frog-like into a new life. It's pre-green, thinned acrylic approximating watercolor, and with a paintbrush, I am pollinating lemon trees, impersonating bees. Still so far from honeyed. I couldn't kill a stink bug, but somehow it was easy to betray you. Ants swarmed the semen damp cloth. Releasing their glossy bodies into moss, I allowed myself to pretend I am not monstrous. Every year this ritual. Spring is only a performance of reinvention. The flowers keep becoming themselves. Always the stink bug concealed behind its shield, the hungry, horny ants, the sparrow undoing her nest as I pull apart my life. I have to believe azalea buds might swoon into forsythia while nearby snow melts to milk. Some proof I could become improbably gentle, good as drops of water on turned dirt. Okay, let's see. I will do, so the third section in the book is a long series prose poem, and it's called Latitude, and it's in 10 different little pieces. So I'll just read a few of those. Okay, the first one. Back then, I was committed to the color blue, felt moved to paint my walls, nails, furniture, the same shade of teal. Now my body swells at the window with casual longing. Do you believe in saltwater gargling as a cure? At the gas station, I felt proud to specify it was the Navy lighter we wanted. Often the bravest thing I do all day is open my mouth. On every beach washes up the memory of some other beach when I didn't evaluate my own body. Last night, Orion's belt filled me with dread because everyone I have shown it to has exited my life with no warning. Still, I couldn't help myself. The light was brief and obvious. Section 3. Weekends, I went to the park and said "aw" at passing dogs. Not knowing the names of breeds the way my white friends did, I sat in an embarrassed silence while they discussed their preferences for dachshunds or Dobermans. I knew the names of plants and trees and constellations, but kept this to myself. Could never sit in a white circle and change the color of conversation. What I liked was sitting in the passenger seat while a capable person found a place to pull over. The hyperbolic shooting stars. I marveled at heaven and the person and felt lucky I had found them, their unabashed turn signals and disregard for trespassing signs. I was light and fearless by proxy. The next morning, we drove further into the park and, like a small round pebble, a noise slipped from my mouth when I saw the geyser surge. The same mineraled gasp, the first time I felt a man erupt inside me. All that giddy bubbling, grand prismatic. Oh, it's so unearthly here on earth. And then I think I'll just read from that Latitude poem. I'll do 2 more from that. Section 5. Newly blueberried air. A man said percolating underneath the full moon and walked me to my car with a calculable expression. To stand in front of the brook in total darkness, to be convinced of something you can't see. When he tried unsuccessfully to open the bottle of wine, I felt tenderness but disappointment, a sadness for us both, the inevitability of after the affair when we slip back into our ingrained lives. I motioned for the corkscrew. He mentioned God. I was surprised, given the scandalous nature of the evening, how predictable it all was. except for the wet grass in the meadow, which was, somehow, unimaginable. And then I'll just read the last section of that long poem. 10. Immigration, the counter, not the act. I cannot determine what expression to make, which of my faces appears in the passport photo. You see, sir, I am searching for relics in degrees north to south. Childhood was a civilization that fell. I'm sorry, I don't know how to answer your question. And I will just read two final poems. This one is called Old Growth. Backward crossovers into years before, airy afternoons licking the wooden spoon, pouring soft blades of grass from a shoe, all ways of saying I miss my mother. I wish I could remember the gentle lilt of my brother's early voice. Instead, I hear clearly the dripping of a basalt fountain. What gets saved? My father fed my sick goldfish a frozen pea, and it lived for another 6 years. Outside, pears swathed in socks ripened, protected from birds. Those bulbous, multicolored days, I felt safe before I knew the word for it. But how to fossilize a feeling, sustain it in amber? I keep dreaming in reverse until I reach a quiet expanse of forest. The dragonflies are large and prehistoric. Mother watches from a distance as I move wildly without fear. And the final poem that I will read from the book, if I can find it. Okay, yes. This one is called In My Next Life, Let Me Be a Tomato. In my next life, let me be a tomato, lusting and unafraid. In this bipedal incarnation, I have always been scared of my own ripening, mother standing outside the fitting room door. I only become bright after Bloody Marys, only whole in New Jersey summers where beefsteaks like baubles sag in the yard, where we pass down heirlooms in thin paper envelopes and I tend barefoot to a garden that snakes with desire, unashamed to coil and spread. Cherry falls, brandy wine, sweet aperitif, I kneel with the spool, staking and tying, checking each morning after last night's thunderstorm, only to find more sprawl. The tomatoes have no fear of wind and water. They gain power from the lightning, while I, in this version of life, retreat in bed to wither. In this life, rabbits are afraid of my clumsy gait. In the next, let them come willingly to nibble my lowest limbs, my outstretched arm always offering something sweet. I want to return from reincarnation's spin covered in dirt and buds. I want to be unabashed, audacious, to gobble space, to blush deeper each day in the sun, knowing I'll end up in an eager mouth. An overly ripe tomato will begin sprouting, so excited it is for more life, so intent to be part of this world, trellising wildly. For every time in this life I have thought of dying, let me yield that much fruit in my next, skeleton drooping under the weight of my own vivacity as I spread to take more of this air, this fence post, this forgiving light. Thank you so much.
Wow. That was wonderful. That's a terrific reading, and congratulations again on that book. And how cool to have it chosen by Ada Limón, who, as you all know, was chosen to be our new U.S. Poet Laureate. So thank you for that good reading, Natasha. Next, I would like to introduce Becca Mara McKay. Becca is a poet and translator. She directs the creative writing MFA at Florida Atlantic University, where she's also a faculty advisor to Swamp Ape Review. Her publications include poetry, A Meteorologist in the Promised Land, and Happiness in the Happiness is the New Bedtime, and several translations of fiction and poetry from modern Hebrew. Her newest book of poems, The Little Book of No Consolation, came out in 2021 from Barrow Street Press. Congratulations for that, Becca. And she has recent publications in Spoon River Review, Permafrost, and Southwest Review. Welcome to Becca McKay.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the museum. Thank you, Dr. Hine. Natasha, thank you for your amazing reading. That was beautiful. And I guess I will just start. This is the book, Little Book of No Consolation, that came out last year. So I'm going to begin with some poems from this book. Every section in this book is it comes from a word from a dictionary. It's not from a dictionary, but I call it a dictionary, but it was a calendar of forgotten English words. And so I wrote a poem about all of those words. The first one in the first section is called Graveyard Working, which was a social gathering for the purposes of cleaning the cemetery. Years ago, I was a room, unprepared for the renovations. The trapdoor of my body unlatched and all the blueprints burned. A cloud is a room for holding tomorrow's weather. Sky is a room for the education of orioles. A bell is a room for warnings, and ashes are a room for the detonator's dirge. And so the explosions I escaped in Jerusalem moved in next door to haunt me. A cemetery is a room. The sea with its whales is the room after that. The next section starts with a poem called Inhabitiveness, which was the desire to remain in one place. The lost art of God's failure to erase each ridge and bump from your skull was given to us by Franz Gall, father of phrenology, a method invented to codify God's errors. A bump for adventurers and a bump for homebodies, a bump for the vicious and a bump for the kind. Before you were born, God wrapped his hands around your head, a gift you won't remember, held by the wisdom of everything. You were small, but the womb grew smaller, and you wriggled from his fingers. The field of hillock and furrow that remained in the shape of God's grip is not, as Gall believed, a map of human disposition, or a way to predict criminality, a bump for kicking dogs, a bump for nurturing grudges, but an atlas of every room you'll enter before you die, and how the light inside will embrace the dust, and who will be there to greet you. The story of every threshold you will cross before you return to the cradle of God's palms, before he smooths your skull for good. This is called Materializing the Gesture of Resistance. And that title comes from something the artist Sharon Daniel said at a talk that I went to. I would go to her website. I would see her work, Sharon Daniel. I think it's sharondaniel.net. But she does kind of installation pieces and in-place pieces. And the piece she had, it was part of it was an interview with a woman inmate who sewed American flags. And that's all really you need to know. Last night, I held a vigil for the lunar eclipse, an awkward ritual, like sitting for hours at the deathbed of someone you know well, but don't know how to talk to. Someone who would whisper, "Even angels don't believe in angels," to a child, the direction of the rescheduled dark already clear and cast in a dull red glow. The earth's shadow was a mouth lifted in laughter or incantation as it swallowed the moon. To materialize our resistance is to build instead of break, or to build after the breaking, to take up needle and thread alongside the seam ripper so that the building can be done with broken things. In the darkness, I could not identify the immovable object, the stone god we wait on in vain. When the moon was all amber, I felt relief, like a soldier whose shift has just ended, or like a soldier shaken from sleep, whose shift is about to begin. I have a series of poems throughout this book that all the titles are the Latin names of animals, as it's the name and then as mistranslation. So this one is called Pseudocris triceriata as mistranslation, and that's a kind of frog. The family to my west is immense with exile. Every morning, the matriarch's mother-in-law, her face a cradle of bone and protest, sings litanies to God or to the flight paths, whichever appears closer. Sieved with disbelief, I pretend she can send anything winged to peel me from sleep, so that my dreams are a rash of interrupted color. Last night, her driveway was migrating, spasms of tarry pebbles trying to marry my hedges, until I knelt in the light slate web and saw hundreds of tiny frogs, rough beads, reassessing their relationship with gravity. One jumped to my palm and froze, so acute with stillness, I was ashamed and laid it in the weeds that erupt in green knuckles of forgiveness, as though preparing for this clash of convergence and flight, finally able to bear the weight of fresh exodus. This is called The News from Florida. Like the Montreal father who urges his family out of the house in the wake of a grease fire sweeping the kitchen, the cardinal seems to scream, "Vite, vite, vite, vite," from the banyans branches. And like the sirens of fire trucks too far away to be more than a sharpness lining the sky, the dove's wings whistle down the distance from tree to weedy lawn. I have no idea if the roof of this world will catch fire. And like the boots of the firefighter arriving at the pub with nothing slung over his shoulder but curdled relief, the woodpecker repeats its startled gargle from the utility pole. Small animals are everywhere around us, in hedges and under floorboards, beneath palm fronds. This is Pikari Chajaku as mistranslation. The javelina is a narrower animal than you expected based on its lineage, distant cousin to the domesticated pig, or from your first glimpse of it leaning against a wire fence in papery light. A furred football, stubbed legs tucked under its belly, caught in conversation with the dust. But when it rises to face you head on, all the laws of dimension, always a challenge for you and your tethered vision, are suspended. This is a creature designed for downtown parking, or for the useless space between refrigerator and sink, too shallow for storage, too short for appliance. Every part of the javelina is desert-hued, except for the end of its flat and animate snout, pink and naked as your latest scar. Dear sir, your letter to the desert would have said, before you met the desert's best specimen, I am wary of any place that has the power to kill me with its breath. But now you know the Mojave grows its own jokes, like any biome with enough time on its hands. And you understand the mystery in this distance, even with your flawed eyes flattening everything into tapestry and screenshot. Okay. Oh, this is another Latin name poem. Ishna umbrosa as mistranslation, and that's a kind of dragonfly. The cardinal isn't eating plastic, as I first believed, but removing the wings of a dragonfly she caught for breakfast. She chats in bright chimes while she swallows her prey, part pride, part warning. In every season here, animals pin desire to my window. One snow blue night, a buck showed up to take his shot at the suet and seeds, the moon losing itself in the late velvet of his antlers. He froze a moment in the slap of motion lights, his tongue muscling inside the feeder as thin ghosts of steam left his body. I don't know what he stood for. Maybe he stood for nothing but his own hunger, like the cardinal pleased to pluck glass wings from the dragonfly and discard them, transparent as air. They flap back and forth like pages from a book the cardinal means to read as soon as she returns. This is a title poem of this book, The Little Book of No Consolation, and it's I dedicated this book to my uncle who died right before the pandemic. And this was after a conversation we had when we were in Jerusalem together. What's the first thing you'll tell God when you get a chance? I asked my uncle. His hands are square as sandwiches, and he examines them with astonished grief, as though they've become lazy dragons napping next to his wrists. Twice a day, the sun's slant turns every wall in Jerusalem into God's forge, sudden gold, masquerading as the source of all misery or all mercy. He notices me waiting behind his hands and dismisses them with a shake. Why would God give me another chance? I hope we have pockets in the afterlife so we won't have to spend eternity learning to separate coins and lint from lists and licorice. I'm going to read one more from this book before I read some new poems. This is also from what I call the Dictionary of Misremembered English. It's called Donkey's Breakfast, which was the name of a straw mattress in a sailor's bunk. We slept on straw when straw was safer than the ground, believing the body's final home has power. We slept on the ground when the ground was safer than the trees, believing in bone and ash and the last place the body makes itself comfortable. We slept in the trees to escape the jaws of our enemies, honoring the last place the body faced its fears. We slept in the jaws of our enemies to understand hunger. We mark the last place the body removes its shoes or holds another body or pays attention to the other bodies all around. We slept in hunger when we sought God. We remember the last place the body gives up, the last place the body rests, tree or tomb or miles below the sea's green burden. When we were finished, we slept in God. So I heard somebody say once that there's always a poem in one book that is actually the beginning of your next book. I don't know if that's true, but if it is, then that poem, I think, sort of signaled to me my next book. So these are some poems from the manuscript that I'm working on now. And one of the things I did with this manuscript is I found this book of paintings by the painter Archie Rand. And he did a painting for every one of the 613 commandments in the Hebrew Bible. And so I did my morning free writing every day based on one of those paintings. And so I ended up writing a lot about Leviticus and learning more about Leviticus. And so I think the next couple of poems are vaguely related to Leviticus. This one is called Hurricane Season, Leviticus 11:27. And Leviticus 11:27, in case you've forgotten, is one of the prescriptions against eating unclean animals. And it's in 2 sections. 1, at least stand up when you do that, says God, who brings rain and coyotes and little black seeds beloved by finches, but stumbles when confronted by the human urge to make killing more efficient. As always, we name the apocalypse too late, its chainsaw teeth already dipping into the forbidden tree. In August, the neighbors insist we remove the banyan who governs the yard, wisest uncle handing berries to visiting waxwings, hosting hordes of lizards, tilting in the vines that harden when they reach the earth, like tendons in a stubborn neck. 2. In October, the coyotes crack the night and wake me, my mouth wide, as if to catch their cries on my tongue. Call it unbearable wildness, like the banyan untethered by storm. I want, I sing, I sound, say coyotes, who calibrate night with the instruments of their voices. Unclean animals, excuse me, practicing private music. So Leviticus seizes the good and the dangerous alike from our mouths and never gives it back to God, who hates how we choose to use iron, whose gales can never compete, who forbade us in vain from eating blood. We let the banyan stand. This one is called Leviticus as Campaign Rally in Midsummer, 1144. So Leviticus 1144 is do not eat maggots. Finally, a commandment I can follow. Although who's to say disaster won't name me to a list of sorry survivors, leaving hunger and sin together on my tongue? Who's to say I won't end up eating maggots beside a banked fire, asked to bear witness to the failed world, while the loons weep their path down dawn's burning back? Centuries ago, loons were the loudest singers in the sky, the truest throat of warning. Now bad news is the din curving close, planet-shaped. As with any shadow imposed on any sphere, one edge of danger always appears nearer than the rest. Call this stretch of shadow 13 seconds of silence. Call it go back to where they came from. Name the shadow's reach for anything on fire. When I began to write these words, I meant to say, no problem, I won't eat maggots. And in this small refusal, I'd remain committed to an ongoing lack of apocalypse. But I'm not the same person who said, don't give disaster a reason to bring you along for the ride. I know now there is no one I will not stand with against the dark. Once I admired goldfinches for their roller coaster flights, convinced they moved this way for joy alone. I see one now, small bright fist, punching waves into the sky, and I think, escape. Excuse me. This is called For Moon, Read Moon. Every second or third time I watched the sun climb down into the sea, I saw a pair of fruit bats performing their complicated exchange. For exchange, read courtship. For courtship, read wait for nightfall. But for nightfall, read my silence, the lost light carrying my tongue over the horizon each time I stood on the sand facing west. For horizon, read this is not my country. For this is not my country, read I too wanted wings made from my own skin. Bats belong to caves, so we know they are ancient. For caves, read safety. The path to the water took me past the old city, where I stopped to witness dozens of them unfolding a hollow darkness. For darkness, read darkness. I wasn't afraid. They belonged everywhere I could not, crossing and crossing and crossing the moon. I'm going to read, I think, 2 more or 3 more. A lot of my poems take place in Minnesota because that's where I spend my summers. That's where I am from. Although this one takes place in Wisconsin, it's kind of the same difference to me. Poem that takes anatomical liberties. My bones are mostly held in place by other bones, which is to say, I nearly escaped the plates and screws that teach the human skeleton to knit after disaster. The thought of home is slick with snow, the Wisconsin hill where my voice seizes in my throat as though the trail's brash plummet heightens my shyness. I stick to silence like a beetle under the collector's pin. In retreat from evening's bruised reach, my companions have to echo for me. Hello, hello, hello. This is called Everything Done with the Utmost Respect. My stepmother donated her body to science. So when she died, science took her body away. When science finished with her body, they burned it to ashes, put the ashes in a box, and returned them to my father. He says, next summer we'll scatter them near the falls. Whatever isn't prayer will masquerade as prayer by clasping its hands tight to whiten the knuckles, the breath an unknown country in the throat. I know why we don't speak ill of the dead. They're listening in the mirrors, bending light to catch our slander, the way a bat bends sound to catch a moth in flight. And I'm just going to read one more. This is for my students because I'm always making them read pretty new stuff. And so this is actually the most recent poem that I have written. And I thought that if they're watching, they will appreciate this. If cruelty is the syntax of power, then last night's teeth, unseen and strict, were the last grammar lesson of a pregnant rabbit who left nothing behind but her liver and a pale fetus roughly the shape and size of my thumb. So much of survival relies on a violence we never witness until it is spelled out on bloodstained pavement. I stuffed my alarm back into my mouth. Like every bad idea, I found the grace not to speak out loud. Almost on cue, a pair of loons began narrating these events to each other in detailed hysteria while crossing overhead. Loon calls will convince anyone the sky is burning. Already they've persuaded my skin to pull itself to goosebumps. Like God's name, the loon call belongs in my ears, but never on my tongue. If the forbidden is the syntax of the holy, then coyotes are the day's high priests, sharp grins hidden. Above the loons, vultures wobble and dip. What remains after a killing is the syntax of vultures, who are themselves a language I'm still learning to translate. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Becca. Terrific reading. Both of you guys, wow. It's one thing to read your poems in the books and they hold up and they're fabulous, but to hear you read them, it's really special. So thank you. Thank you both. We're going to segue into the Q&A. And you may, I don't know if you can see some of the questions beside you, but I'm going to vary them just a little bit anyway. As I ask you about your poems, and some of this might pertain to individual poems, but some, if you're thinking in terms of a whole book or a manuscript, then that's wonderful too. So I'm struck by, wow, you both really use the stuff of the world, and you use such terrific detail in your poems, such sensual language, and I think it really carries your poems all the way through. Your poems find ways to weave in these wonderful, rich details. So I'm interested in your use of imagery, and I'm interested especially in your use of metaphors and your metaphorical leaps. This is a question, I think it's actually a little further down the list that you might see, but can you talk a little bit, because I do notice that this is something you both do a lot of. You find ways to weave metaphor into your poems. You do these wonderful leaps, which give your poems a kind of surprise, Can you talk a little bit about your use of metaphorical leaps, where you decide where to place them, how you decide where to place them in the poem, and which of those you choose to follow? How important are these leaps, in your opinion, to your poems? Who would like to start? Natasha, you want to go?
Sure, yeah, that's a really great question. I was just mulling it over. Yeah, I think that's a really lovely way of thinking about a metaphor. And for me, I feel like most of my poems are kind of image driven. So I think that's one of your other questions, like where do the poems start? But for me, it's usually an image that's just kind of like in my head, and just for like a few weeks, I'll be walking around and it's kind of spinning around in there. And then that will happen with a few different images. So in the poem Divine Transformation, like I just had this very strong memory suddenly of being in India and visiting a temple or seeing a bunch of Jain nuns and like learning about them. And then a few weeks later, that was still in my head. And then I was thinking about eating sushi, and just sort of then having all these very salient images and figuring out a way to kind of connect them is usually sort of the map of how my poems go. And then metaphor is the way to get there, like the tool I'll use. So I think it's like it's a really interesting way. Also, I mean, I'm very interested in the idea of transformation and things becoming other things. And I think the poem is a really wonderful space because, like, if I want to be a tomato in my next life, I can be a tomato in the poem. Like I can envision all the ways that that's existing. And so when you're asking about like sustaining a metaphor, I think if it's just something that's fun for me to think about, like what are all the different ways I could explore tomatohood, if that's what we'll call it, and then just keep writing and keep going with that. It just feels like it's, yeah, usually an image, and then I'll think of how can I connect to something else, or just something that I've been really ruminating on a lot. I was doing a lot of gardening in my backyard, my parents' backyard where I am now, but and just kind of thinking, you know, like hands in the soil at all times, thinking about tomatoes and just becoming obsessed with that. So for me, metaphor is a really cool way to like enact what I want to become, or what I want other things to become, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah. Great answer. Thank you. Becca.
Wow, that's so interesting. I mean, one thing I will say is that I literally just yesterday taught metaphor to my beginning creative writing students. So I feel like if any of them are watching, I have to be very careful that I don't contradict anything I said, although I probably will, because I feel like the way I think about writing is often a little contradictory. For me, poems start with language, and the images come from how the language ends up juxtaposed, right? Because I do free writing every morning, and then I type it up the next day, and then I look at it like sometimes weeks later, and I pick out the things that I like, and I kind of jam them all together. And so even though I think when you read my poems, they sound or seem very maybe idea based or metaphor based, I feel like those things attach themselves later to the language. I mean, I think that I think in metaphor and I speak in metaphor all the time. And so it's just my form of expression. I think that's where it comes from. And then it ends up in the poems because it's already in the language, right? I spend a lot of my time just generating language and collecting language, which I think is similar to what Natasha is saying, except that it's language and not images, right?
Yeah, interesting. I'm thinking that something you said reminded me of, I think it's Aristotle who said the essence of poetry is metaphor, right? But you know, I guess back to the way you posed it, Natasha, when you have so many different fragments, I think the interesting thing is how to know what goes, you know, which of those fragments can you connect that then become a portal to some new way you want to go in the poem. And that to me is great fun, you know, in poetry. And yes, to always have it grounded in those rich images that comes through so strongly, really in both of your work. You've got those images all the way through. And then so often connected to these leaps that I think are just really terrific. So thank you for those good answers. Could you talk, you mentioned, Becca, that you start most of your poems with free writes. So I'm interested in that because that's something that in my classes at Eckerd, that was something I really pushed with all of my students, you know, whether it was free writing or, you know, brainstorming or clustering, you know, or sort of all three of the imaginative prompts all together. But what to then go from that initial free write and to see where the poem leads, really gets into the whole craft. Like, how do you go from that initial free write where you've got language going on, you love how it sounds, the words start to kind of meld, but then you build them into an idea and you've got the leaps coming in. I'm interested really in your whole craft, how you go from that first idea from a free write or cluster or brainstorm, however you do it, to then shaping it into a poem. And I realize this is kind of a big question. And then even your revision process. Where do you go from there? Can you talk just a little bit about from where you start to where you think maybe the poem is ending? Do you want to start first this time, Becca?
Sure. It's funny because like all my stuff is right here. See all this paper? Because I am a hand writer, right? I do everything by hand many, many times until it actually makes it onto the computer. Mm-hmm. So I'm drafting a lot. So I'm basically collecting all the language that I like and snippets from this day and that day, and putting it all on one page to see what happens. And the poem sort of starts to reach its way out of there. And then I'm copying it. I'm like thinking about line and rhythm as I'm doing that. And I mean, that's probably the most coherent way that I can describe it. And also, but I try, I read this thing Elisa Gabbard wrote the other day. It was one of those craft of writing things, and she was talking about you shouldn't be too married to your process because it'll get stale. And so I'm hesitant to say this is how I do it,
right?
I think you have to change it up, right? Like I heard Ross Gay say once that you should write in whatever way makes you slow down the most, right? You should, so that you can write as slowly as possible. And so that might, that I think it's that slowness that I have always tried to, that's why I have like 10 handwritten drafts before I even put it on the computer. And then I'll print it out, but then I'll delete it so that it still only exists on paper. And really, I don't save it until I'm ready to send it to my friend from grad school, who's my first reader and has been for, probably close to 20 years. And then I'm willing to think about it as something that I'm revising. But before that, it's just draft after draft. It feels like having to carve marble with my hands.
Okay.
Which I know that sounds so painful, but I think that's how I feel about it.
Okay. Natasha, how about you?
I love the carving marble. I think, yeah, I totally understand. For me, yeah, I mean, I handwrite my initial like free write, and I always write in prose initially. So I write in like full sentences and long lines. And then from there, once I have that written, I'll type it up. And then I usually wait like a week to transcribe it and then kind of like discover new things about it as I'm typing it up. And then we'll usually like wait a few days or something and then kind of pull out the more salient. Usually for me, it's images, but sometimes there will be like really nice lines in there. And then it does feel like sort of to go with the marble. I'm just kind of paring down this big piece and making it into a small object. And for me, the language usually comes at the end. So I'll have kind of the shape and like the way that I want to connect everything. And then I'll go in and from whatever that like plain spoken, like frantic draft that I had written, then I'll go in and sort of like look through the dictionary or the thesaurus and sort of work that way, as those are my like polishing, burnishing it at the end. Sometimes I'll start from language. And so like you were saying, Becca, it's nice to like not be committed to one way of working. And it always feels nice when like a line will just pop into my head, or or the poem will get written in the form that it's meant to be written in. But usually I go from like a big block, and then and I usually wait. I mean, I probably don't need to do this, but I like to wait at least like a week increments before I look at it, because I always feel just with fresh eyes that I discover something new. And then I send it out to a couple first readers, and then I definitely revise. Like, it's a long revision process. So
Yep. Yeah. And the next question is tied to what we just discussed, and you both even used the word, and that's the word form. I am interested in, if you could just expand on what you said a little bit. So I'm interested in your thoughts on form, which doesn't necessarily have to mean formal poetry, may or may not. But I am curious, if you do choose to write in a particular form. I'm thinking about your prose poems, which both of you do so beautifully. And then Natasha, with what you just said about you're typically just writing, and also with you, Becca, starting with a free write anyway. I'm curious about, does a poem do you typically hold off till the end of the poem to see what shape that poem is ultimately going to take? And do you even bust it open sometimes and try to put it, give it a new life, or see if maybe it wants to be let off a leash a little bit by messing it up? I'm thinking about this a lot right now because I'm in the middle of totally busting open a sonnet crown that I worked on so hard and so long, and now I'm blowing it up completely. But could you talk about that, the way you decide what form the poems are ultimately likely to take on your page, and do you try different forms before it finds its home, if you will? Whichever.
Sure, yeah, I can start. I think form is one thing that I would like to be thinking about more. It's usually sort of like the last thing that I consider, and my poems are pretty much all like left justified, free verse, and I want to get more into experimenting with form, but I find form, or like formal poetry, for me, when I'm stuck, that's the easiest way for me to get into something. So I'll say, like, I am going to write an abecedarian, or like I'm going to write a sonnet, and those are always like the Nicole Seeley, the poem after Nicole Seeley that I read. Just giving myself some kind of constraint makes me think in a completely different way and write in a different way, and it's always a surprising poem that I would not have achieved had I gone the usual route.
Right.
So form is definitely something that helps me, that I turn to when I am sort of like, I want to write something, but I'm at a loss here. Let me just try something new. And it feels really fun. It's like a playful way of thinking and working. It feels more like a puzzle, and I'm dealing with like language in a more material way than I am normally thinking about it. So yeah, I think it's definitely something that I want to keep doing. And usually it's when I encounter a poem that I really love, that's in an unusual form, I'll try to emulate that. So I have kind of like a template.
Yeah. And I love your abecedarian. That's wonderful, by the way. Yeah, that's great. Becca, what do you think?
I think that, I have written lots of different forms, and I've taught classes in form, and I like to have my students make up their own forms, but I believe that every poem is in a form, even if that form only belongs to that poem, right? At least for me, I feel like I need to make rules for my poems, because I need that, like Natasha said, I need the constraint, in order to have something for the imagination to push against. So I think, like right now I've been working on a pantoum. So that's a very particularly formal kind of writing. But I also, I will decide, okay, every line in this poem, has to have, can't be longer than 8 beats, or or maybe I'll say, okay, what if I did 8, 10, 8, just something to help me rein it in, I guess. They always have to have rules. But prose poems, a lot of the poems in this book, in the little book of no consolation, or a chunk of them were published in a chapbook, Happiness is the New Bedtime, and in that chapbook they were all prose poems. And then later I looked at them again, and I was like, okay, I think there are lines here that I need to that they needed to kind of break out of that. But I like writing prose poems when I feel like that's the kind of energy I want the poem to have, when I want each line to inform the next line, kind of like I think of them as being kind of improvisational jazz.
Mhm.
So I have, so I have my rules for prose poems too, but
Yep.
yeah, I guess I have a lot of rules, but unlike Natasha, I never think of it as fun. I mean,
Yeah.
I wish I did. I wish I thought it was more fun, but it's something else. It's something besides fun. It's not fun. Something, some other space, some other state of being, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've all heard that, especially if we're writing something that's difficult or painful, that there's a real element of grief at a poem. At least I find this very true for my poems, to have some specific vessel in which to pour that emotion, and to, like you said, sort of contain it a bit in a way, I think has been really helpful. So I know, what you're talking about, but I am finding it sometimes a little exacerbating, but mostly, kind of fun to break them out and try them in different ways. And trying to think about, and I agree completely, even a poem that's written strictly as a free verse poem, still that is a form. I mean, and certain poems should be irregular, should have 8 stanzas in one place and 3 in another. And it just depends on what the poem is exploring. And anyway, that's just something that I'm interested in, your thoughts, because I'm playing around with that more myself. So thank you for those answers. I was thinking about what you said about the pantoum, Becca, but because I noticed in your poems, you often will use a lot of really great repetition. So it seems to me that any kind of repeating poem, like a pantoum or villanelle, you would be really strong at. So I look forward to seeing that in your next book. But so let's see. Can you both talk for a few minutes about place in your poems? And I think for this one, I'm going to combine 2 things. The role of time, because both of you seem, at least to my eye and ear, to move both forward and backward in time. You move around a lot in your poems. I love that. I think it's really effective for both of you. So could you just talk for a few minutes about your use of time in your poems, but also the role of place in your poems?
Place.
Whether it's
those are so big.
yeah, I know. Sorry.
No, it's not a criticism.
They are big questions.
I do feel like so I spend every summer in Minnesota, and otherwise, usually I'm here, right, in Florida, and these are 2 parts of the country that couldn't be more different. And so I think that at least lately, I've been writing about or against that contrast, right? I've been trying to sort of work out who I am in each place. Maybe that's what I mean. Also, I write a lot about animals and birds, and we have different animals and birds here and there, and yet the same animals are always showing up in the poems. So I don't, excuse me, I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but I think that before the pandemic, I used to travel a lot, and now it seems like a long time ago that happened. A lot of this book also takes place in Italy, where I used to also spend part of the summers, and Israel, where I spend a lot of time because I'm a translator of Hebrew. So I guess place in my poems is just what sticks, right? It's what I take from every place I've been and can't get rid of.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Do you want to?
No, please.
Okay. I think in a kind of similar, I am thinking all the time, not to keep using the word time, but I'm always thinking sort of in like, memory, thinking about the past, and then what all is happening kind of simultaneously right now, and what could happen or what could have happened. And so like, that's just sort of the way that I think. And I think one of the reasons why I enjoy writing poetry rather than like a linear novel or something, is because I have that freedom to just jump around, and it doesn't keep me from like, what's going on? How come you're going all over? So it's just kind of the way that I've been thinking, at least time-wise. And then I'm working on a new project now, which I was showing some new poems to and telling someone like, oh, it's all about place. And then they said to me, well, like none of the poems you're not in any of the places you're writing about. So then I'm like, oh, maybe it's displacement. And like, for whatever reason, I can always write about a place, but only when I'm not in it. So I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out what the deal is with that as well. But I think it's kind of like you were saying, Becca, like it's what I carry around with me. And again, those images. And when I'm out of a place, I'm just thinking about like, oh, I don't know, the month of August, and I'll just have these sort of highlights and like certain little bright like bits of color that are from different places. So yeah, I think just the idea of being able to travel through time and through place in like a little short block is really fascinating and fun. And it's I enjoy reading other poems when it's sort of just going all over the place, because I feel like I'm going on a little journey. So that's I just enjoyed that process and that feeling of motion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I have seen in both of your books, playing around, and I love this, with shifting identities, multiple selves, if you will, which I'm particularly interested in right now. And I think the idea of, I guess I was wondering a little bit about the way both place and time, where we are at any given time, what we're thinking about, whether it's past or future, all of those things, I think in some ways shape a little bit of who we are in that particular moment, that particular identity. Yeah, that's probably I'm moving around a lot in that question, but I get it. Okay. So just one more question that I'd love to hear you guys talk briefly about. Can you talk a little bit about your process of putting a manuscript together? Because you guys you've been doing that recently. You'll be doing it again for your next books. There's so many different philosophies on how to do that, including throwing them up in the air and picking them up. How do you go about doing that?
Well, I think each book for me has been different, and like when I said for the chapbook, that I just pulled all these prose poems together and was like, well, let's see how these work together. But for the full-length books, it was, I tend to write in series, right? Like I'll write but not a long enough series to be a whole book, which I think is fine. And so I will put all the series together and say, okay, how did these series of poems speak to each other? And then I tend to mix them up, so that you have to kind of go through the book to find the different, but I do that thing. I don't know, Natasha, if you've done this, where I lay them all out on the floor. And or I'll put a bunch of them on the corkboard, just to, see how they are in conversation with each other. But that, that is, I always think that I'm going to do something that's sort of more focused, more thematic, but I don't think I have the attention span for it. I'd rather do the bunch of little series and then sort of shuffle them together like cards.
Okay, thank you. Natasha?
Yeah, so for this book, it was, I think, definitely more of like just a collection of poems. So I wasn't thinking about it really as a project ever. And then when I just kind of amassed enough poems, I printed them all out, put them on the wall, and just kind of tried to find which ones don't fit, which is there sort of a thread, and are there any kind of like gaps that I should maybe try to write into. So I had like a few places where I was like, okay, I could probably use a little bit of glue here to make this make a little more sense. But I'm trying to think like for the next project about maybe doing something a little more thematic, though I don't know also if I have the stamina for it, we'll see, but it feels like maybe a fun, like a new interesting way to think about kind of top down, like I'm going to write poems about this road trip across the country and see where it goes from there. But yeah, just that the printing out is always an enjoyable part, and just I had it of all those poems on the wall like right above my bed, so I would just wake up every day for months like surrounded by the poems. Like, at the end of it I was like, this is horrible, I need to like finish this, but I'm just living in the world. But yeah, just there's something definitely about seeing it and being able to move them around and see it, and then also to kind of think to myself like, oh, there are so many poems with birds that are all next to each other, like maybe I ought to maybe that works, maybe. Yeah, so things that I probably would not have noticed on a first glance became apparent as I would just kind of stare at the mass for days. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think our time is probably up, but thank you both so much for, first of all, for your terrific poems, and then for reading them for us in the Dalí Poetry Series. It's been such a pleasure to have you here. And also thanks to all of you for tuning in to the series. This program will stay up on our Dalí YouTube channel. And so please, any friends and our family or fans who maybe can't, who are not able to be watching tonight on our premiere, you can tune in at any point in the future. So thank you all so much, and hope to see you again soon.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Fun.
Bye.